reading a little commentary on Gideon out of Judges 6. Reading commentary on Gideon, but we're going to be reading Judges 9 about Abimelech in a couple of days. But wanted to give a little foundation on Gideon first. Amen. So Gideon was the fifth judge and renowned as the greatest of Israel. The account of his life is recorded in Judges. The backdrop for Gideon's biography begins with the Israelites being ravaged by the Midianites as a consequence of Israel's disobedience to God. Yep, Israel disobeying again, family. For 7 years, they faced invasions from the Midianites, Amalekites, and eastern foreigners who ruined their crops and destroyed their cattle. God's discipline through the foreign nations caused the Israelites to cry out to God for help again. Amen. God sends them a prophet to remind them of how the one true God had provided for them in the past and how quickly they have forsaken him. God hears their cries and graciously intervenes to deliver his people. He starts by sending the angel of the Lord to Gideon to call him into service. Gideon, whose name means cutter or cutter of trees, belonged to an undistinguished family of Abiezrites, and he saw himself as an unfit for God's service. Did y'all hear that? An ordinary man. An ordinary man who did not think himself worthy to represent God. You know what, family? That's one thing I find in common with men who are called by God is a lot of them don't want to go. Yeah, they have self-esteem issues. But the ones who just go, they seem to have the best self-esteem in the world. They want to be seen. They want to be the big shot, right? But the ones who are truly called by God don't think themselves worthy. That's a message. Amen. During his conversation with the angel, it becomes apparent to Gideon that he's speaking to the Lord himself. But Gideon needed proof positive that it was in fact God calling him to the divine task of leading a military force against Midian. Gideon asked the angel of the Lord to stay where he was while Gideon went to prepare a meal. Gideon returned with some food, which he set on a rock. Then God gave a sign. The angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. Gideon built an altar in that place and called it, "The Lord is Peace," because he had seen God and did not die. The same night, Gideon destroyed the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole that belonged to his father. For this bold action, Gideon received the nickname Jerubbaal, meaning "let Baal contend." Later, as an alliance of Israel's enemies, an alliance of Israel's enemies entered the land, and the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon. In the scriptures, family, it says the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. And he blew a trumpet summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. Men from the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali joined Gideon. After the troops had been mustered, Gideon grew nervous. He asked God for another sign to confirm his calling. He put out a piece of wool overnight and asked God to take it, wet it while keeping the surrounding dirt dry. God graciously did as Gideon asked. How many of y'all know when God calls you, he's with you? Yeah, he never leaves you. He clothes you in his spirit when he calls you. Amen. Then Gideon asked for another sign. This time he asked God to keep a fleece dry while making the surrounding dirt wet. Again, God complied. And Gideon was finally convinced that God meant what he said, and that under Gideon's leadership, the nation of Israel would have victory over Midian. But God was not done increasing Gideon's faith. Before entering battle, Gideon's troops numbered 32,000, but in obedience to God, he reduces them to 22,000. God further pares down his army, leaving Gideon just 300 men. This was against an enemy that is described as thick as locusts, with camels as countless as the sand on the seashore. God's purpose was to prevent Israel from boasting that their own strength had saved them. Side note, family, God still has to remind us sometimes that it's not us, it's him. Amen. That reminds me of some of my testimony, right? How hard it was. How at a time in my life where I didn't think anybody was there. But when I look back on it, I think God made it that way, so that when I came out, I could only give him the glory. And today, that's exactly what I do. Give him the glory. Because there was nobody there except for God. Amen. Amen. That night, God sent Gideon into the midst of the Midianite camp. There, Gideon overheard a couple of frightened Midianites discussing a dream that they took to portend disaster for them. Hearing this encouraged Gideon, and he rallied his troops. Using some unusual tactics, Gideon and his 300 men attacked the Midianite coalition and routed the enemy troops. After victory, the people of Israel wanted to make Gideon their first king, but he demurred, saying, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. Y'all don't remember this. Don't forget this, okay? This is exactly why we're going to be reading about Abimelech. Amen. He said, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. The peace won by Gideon lasted for a generation. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace 40 years. On a sadder note, Gideon requested that the troops contribute gold from the plunder of the battle so he could create a ephod, which he set up in his hometown. Whatever Gideon's intent in fashioning the ephod, the people began to use it for idolatrous purposes, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. In accomplishing the mission God set before him, Gideon proves himself to be a faithful man, a mighty warrior, a strong leader, a diplomat. As such, he is included in a fitting testimonial for the great men of faith in Hebrews 11:32. Yes, he is. I love that testimonial of faith. Y'all go read that. It's very powerful. Gideon's faith seemed to be weak at times, but God patiently worked with him and strengthened his faith to the point that he could carry out God's mission. Gideon's obedience to the Lord required him to take a stand against his own father and his own tribe. He feared what would happen when he tore down his father's idols, but it is evident he feared God much more. In the battle, Gideon took over a far greater odds. In battle, Gideon took on far greater odds than seemed possible, but he knew where his strength lay. The sovereign Lord, the sovereign God is faithful, and he saw Gideon through a battle to victory. Gideon also showed humility when the Israelites wanted to honor him as their king. He's a good example of those who obey the command to trust the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. And finally, family, God uses ordinary people to accomplish his plans. And the key to Gideon's success was his willingness to obey God. Gideon went from being a man in hiding, threshing wheat at the foot of a hill out of sight of the enemy, to vanquishing the same enemy in battle. However, he was careful to ensure it was God's will he was obeying. As the Apostle Paul wrote, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Amen. Much love, family. We'll be reading Judges 9. Soon come. Much love.